Hey everyone, welcome to another tutorial in the CMAC Media Literacy series. If you've kept in touch with us, you're pretty well versed in a variety of concepts of media literacy. What it is, how to fact check sources, detect bias, and how to create media messages responsibly. And now, thanks to Natalie, what media representation is and why it matters. But if that all sounds new to you, don't worry. You can get caught up by watching them all on CMAC's YouTube channel or on our website at cmac.tv/media literacy. In this video, we're going to talk about how the media we consume shapes the way we view the world, and in turn, how we view ourselves. Media is all around us in advertisements, articles, movies, TV shows, streaming platforms, social media, music, everywhere. It would make sense that some of this stuff would leak into our subconscious and start to impact the way we view not only the world we live in, but also how we've come to interpret certain things about our individual identities. And I don't mean our names, where we live, or where we work, but things like our race, gender, or sexual identity. Let's try a quick exercise. Close your eyes and imagine a person, or rather, the shape of a person. Now, I'm going to give you a characteristic to describe that person, and your job is to modify that person to fit the description. Ready? Here we go. Strong. Okay. What does that person look like? Was it a superhero? Someone in your family? An athlete? Chances are, you and I imagine someone different. The reason for that is because we each have a myriad of life experiences that deeply influence our interpretation of certain words and ideologies to define their meaning. Depending on how we grew up, strong could mean our parents, siblings, people in our community, or the people we learned about in school or pop culture. In essence, we're decoding the meaning of the word strong through our individual lenses, rather than relying solely on some textbook or dictionary explanation of it. We begin with a base definition, but then fill in its meaning with our own interpretation of it. And we're doing this all the time without having to think about it. But where things get more complicated is when we have to acknowledge that almost all words, or say media messages, come to us already encoded with an intended meaning. Let's try another exercise. I'm gonna give you a riddle and see if you can solve it before I give you the answer. A father and son get into a car crash and are rushed to the hospital. The father dies, the boy is taken to the operating room, and the surgeon says, "I can't operate on this boy because he's my son." How is this possible? 40 to 70% of people can't solve this riddle because they're unable to imagine that the surgeon is a woman. The surgeon is the boy's mother. How do you suppose that so many people struggle to imagine the surgeon as a woman? The answer, in part, lies in how media has chosen to represent titles like surgeons, doctors, lawyers, or other professional and powerful roles throughout the years. Historically, those roles were played predominantly by men. It may have started as an accurate reflection of the time period. Up until the mid-1960s and 70s, women were either barred from attending college or faced numerous barriers to higher education. So realistically, men did in fact dominate many of these industries. But when the culture shifted and we saw more and more women in these roles in the real world, we didn't see it in movies, TV, or advertisements. So why didn't the media representation of surgeons, doctors, lawyers, etc. change with the times? The answer simply is choice. Every message is created by someone. Further, every movie, television show, or commercial is created by a team with a producer at the top who calls all of the shots. The producer chooses the director, and the director chooses, among other things, the cast. In other words, who gets to play what roles. And when a director makes a casting decision, they use their own interpretations to help them choose who they think is right for the role. They're encoding the idea of, say, a surgeon with what they've always understood it to mean. And if they grew up in an era where women were not allowed to enter certain professions, then a surgeon is a man. Further, if they grew up during a time when people of color were barred from higher education, then that surgeon is a white man. Of course, if their personal views agree with the idea that only men should be in those roles, then they would likely make this choice consciously rather than subconsciously. So why does this matter? Because we all use media, and media deeply influences the way we shape our understanding of not just the people around us, but ourselves as well. Consider what that means for the audience. The world may have changed since that director developed their intricate web of interpretations and meanings about life, but the audience will continue to receive that coding long after society has evolved. And that coding will continue to perpetuate notions that only certain people are qualified to fit particular roles or that those roles only look one type of way. The media may have adequately reflected the real world once upon a time, but at some point, society quickly outpaced the media's depiction of it, and what we have left is simply an interpretation of the world we live in. Cultural theorist Stuart Hall developed the reception theory, which focuses on our decoding process as the audience when we consume media messages. As I said before, those messages come to us already encoded with meaning by the person who created them. Hall's reception theory has to do with how we accept or reject those meanings, in other words, how we decode those meanings. There are 3 categories for which an audience may receive media messages: the dominant reader, the negotiated reader, and the oppositional reader. The dominant reader is the audience type who accepts the message as it was intended by the director or creator. In Disney's Mulan, the animated version, Shan Yu is the big bad villain, and the director chose to depict him with a permanent scowl, glowing, almost inhuman yellow eyes, and sharp canines making it appear as though he has fangs. We accept these traits as evil or villainous when we accept Shan Yu as the bad guy and therefore agree with the director's intended message. The negotiated reader accepts an intended message for the sole purpose of the context for which it was delivered, although they don't personally hold those same views. For example, the violence depicted in films, music, or video games. Many of us don't believe that the purge should ever be a valid, recognized form of legislation, but we'll watch the film anyway with the negotiated view that it is all for the sake of expression, social commentary, and in the name of entertainment. The oppositional reader, however, flat out rejects the director or author's intended meaning and handling of the subject matter because it directly contradicts the viewer's own interpretation. For example, 16 Candles' portrayal of a Chinese foreign exchange student, Long Duck Dong. I understand that he's a caricature for comedic purposes of a film made in the early 80s, but I 100% reject that portrayal as painfully inaccurate, racist, and furthering harmful stereotypes about Asian men. I find nothing about that character funny. As we consume media, we're either accepting the encoded message as is, or we're prioritizing our own personal interpretation above that of the director or the author. The difference between the two is whether we come into the media message with any personal knowledge of that representation, in other words, an interpretation of that character, culture, race, gender, or sexual identity. If we don't, then we have no reason to reject the director or author's interpretation of those things, and we're likely to take the dominant reader approach, accepting their interpretation as is, and therefore carry it with us into the real world. Let's go back to the surgeon example. If the majority of what we see over and over again is that surgeons are white men, then we may well believe that only white men are the best fit for the job. And it may interfere with our ability to see other people in that role, such as women or people of color, which could affect things like college admissions, program acceptances, or hiring practices. Additionally, for those of us who are women or people of color, or both, we may start to believe that being a surgeon is not in our future. Because media is simply someone's interpretation of the real world, we may find ourselves left out of the storylines and therefore come to believe what we see or don't see. For example, LGBTQ characters make up a small fraction of the total characters we see on screen. By default, it sends the message that very few queer people actually exist in the overall population, which could lead a queer person to feel that they truly are an anomaly, even though that is not at all true. In 2021, the Representation Project found that people who identify as LGBTQ+ make up 4.5% of the US population, but they make up only 1.7% of the total number of characters seen in top grossing films. And the statistics are similar for other minority groups. The same report showed that even though 51% of the population are women, the number of women in the media is significantly below that. Only 30% of characters in top grossing films are women. Further, women only make up 42% of characters in TV, 39% in advertisements, 22% in video games, and 20% of music performers in the Billboard Hot 100 charts. What's more, these numbers have only improved slightly over the last decade, meaning although these numbers have slowly increased, they still don't accurately reflect society. And we haven't even begun the discussion on the quality of those representations, but I'll get to that later. Black, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOC, make up 40% of the US population, but only 33% of characters in films. Only recently has the BIPOC community achieved parity, meaning the percentage of representation mirrors the population percentage. In both TV characters at 41% and music performances at 60%. However, I should note that these BIPOC percentages may not accurately represent each individual population. There are still likely disparities in representation for Indigenous, Black, and those races categorically labeled people of color, respectively, because the term BIPOC assembles these groups under one umbrella term. 42% of the population is considered fat, but of the total characters in films, only 7.3% fit the description according to the same study, and it's pretty consistent across the board. 7.7% of TV characters and only 7.2% of characters in advertisements are fat. And the numbers for persons with disabilities are abysmal. Persons with disabilities make up 26% of the population, but less than 2% of the characters in films. 1.6% of TV characters and 2.2% of characters in advertisements. Finally, 24% of our population are over the age of 50, but they only make up 20% of characters in films, 19% in TV, and 7% in advertisements. The lack of diversity in representation sends a clear message that the few interpretations we do see are the standard for those communities. In doing so, it fills in the informational blanks for the things we might not have any personal knowledge of. And aside from the number of times we see certain groups in media, we really ought to consider the quality of that representation as well, because it isn't just about those groups existing in the same space, but also how they exist in the same space. If all 30% of the women we saw in film were not portraying powerful roles such as surgeons, for example, and mainly played domestic, peripheral, or submissive roles, we're likely to believe that women are not intelligent or capable enough to become doctors. Or in the same turn, if all 33% of BIPOC characters were only reinforcing stereotypes, we might believe that most, if not all, stereotypes are just inherent characteristics of each member of the BIPOC community, which they're not. So when we come across codes that we don't already have an interpretation for, we should always ask ourselves whether or not the message's intended meaning is a correct representation of that group. Further, if we're the creators, we should ask ourselves if our interpretation will reflect a correct representation. And if we don't know, then we should turn to those communities the message is about for a better understanding before we rely solely on the director or author's meaning. Because in the end, the media is just an interpretation of reality, not an accurate representation of it. This video was made possible by Community Media Access Collaborative. To learn more, go to cmac.tv/media literacy.